Most people, when they go to the museum, they know how to look at a painting, but they don't know how to read it. Which is to say, they don't see the hidden language of the composition or the color harmony or the story being told by the subject matter, by the characters and how they portray it, and so on. And so in this lecture series titled How to Read a Painting, we will look at masterpieces of painting throughout art history, and by that learn the method of reading them. And so by the end of this first lecture, of this first episode of this series, you will hopefully see this particular painting in quite a different light, and by the end of the series, if you watch it all the way through, you will have gained the ability to look at painting in a way you never thought possible before, and to look at all paintings in that sense. And this series was inspired by my English teacher, Mrs. Grüner, who once told me in one of her classes that she wants to be like those bohemians who go to the museum and who look at paintings who look at one painting for like half an hour, and they actually understand it and see what's going on. And that's what we want to learn too, is starting from today. We want to look at a painting and see what's going on and understand it. And so we will do that today with The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. It's a famous painting, and I will just press the mouse and we will take a look at it. Now, here it is. This presentation will be quite minimal. We will only look at this painting for the next half an hour. I hope that's okay for you. Future lectures will of course be a little more complicated than that, but for now, this is The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. It was painted in 1818 by Caspar David Friedrich, who is a German painter who lived from 1774 until 1840. And this painting is currently in the Hamburger Kunsthalle. I think it's also on exhibition. And Hamburg is a port city in northern Germany. I've actually been to Hamburg before, however, I had not had the opportunity to visit the Hamburger Kunsthalle, which is truly a pity. So I have to make up some time for in the future, but until then this painting is unfortunately only beknownst to me in its digital form. Now the first step that I would like to take when we look at any painting is that we first want to describe what's going on in it, okay, what we're seeing. And this might sound trivial or boring to you because you might say, yeah, François, I've got eyes, okay, so I can see what's going on. But I can assure you, especially as a graphic designer, most people do not know what they're looking at. Okay, most people do not know what they're looking at. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a few minutes to really soak it in. We're going to do that by just, taking our finger and pointing at different elements at the painting, or in the painting, and assigning to them names or descriptions. I always think of it as assigning tags. We take tags and we put them on different elements on this painting. And what this teaches us is that by that we learn how to speak about art. Because if we want to become artists or creators, we have to learn to communicate about the thing we are creating. And this is a perfect way to train that ability. By speaking about art, we also become more conscious of the content of what we are looking at, the content of this painting right now. And so this ability is especially important today, in the age of fast-paced internet content, where we really unlearn to sit still and soak in what we are seeing. And so that's what we're gonna do today. We will now soak in what we're seeing here. And I think the first thing that I'm seeing is this guy right here, He's kind of your everyday guy. He has this coat, he has this staff to help him walk, and he's blonde, but here in Germany many people are blonde, so it's kind of not special. I don't know who that is. It's probably also not important who that is. He kind of looks like your everyday guy. And he's here on this cliff, and the cliff seems to be quite steep. We can only anticipate how deep down it goes in front of there. And I actually don't know how he made it up there, because I think I wouldn't have made it so far without slipping on one of these rocks. And slipping, probably not a good idea if I'm looking down here. Now, this isn't the only cliff. We also have cliffs here and here and here, and also here in the back. And this is interesting because this cliff, you might have not noticed it, but it kind of looks unnatural, doesn't it? It's kind of rectangular. we've got here this beautiful, elegant mountain slopes, and then there's this ugly, rectangular, whatever that is. The title also says it's the wanderer above the sea of fog, and a sea of fog it truly is, because we barely see anything of the landscape that's underneath. Like we have a few trees here sticking out, yes, also here and here. And we can kind of anticipate the color of the trees in that area underneath the painting, which is really beautiful technique on Caspar David Friedrich's behalf, how he kind of makes the fog transparent in these two areas. But other than that, it's really just fog that we're looking here. We have these slopes, and there's a bit of trees here or some fields that you can walk, I think. And like I said, these beautiful mountain slopes, and the fog here is kind of special because it kind of rises up to the sky and blends together with the clouds. So you can't really see where the fog ends and where the clouds begin. It kind of blends into each other, which is really beautiful. And so we have essentially, the wanderer, as we might call him, standing on this cliff, and we have this elaborate landscape before him. Now, that was quite painless and fast, wasn't it? What I want to do next is that I want to analyze this painting from a more technical perspective. And now this might be difficult for you if you don't know so much about the craftsmanship of art, but probably you're an art student or graphic design student, anything of that sort, or you have watched a few YouTube videos about like composition or color theory. And now is your opportunity to employ some of that knowledge. And first thing I like to do is that I would like to describe the style in which this painting was created. Now we can make this very complicated and say it's, I don't know, Byzantine iconography or Flemish Baroque or late German national romanticism. But I really don't want to make it too complicated. For now, let's just say stylistically this painting is, for one, realistic, and secondly, academic. Okay, so realistic and academic. And realistic is really self-explanatory here. It's realistic depiction, almost like a photo of the landscape. And by academic, I mean that Caspar David Friedrich really employs basic academic techniques to produce this really beautiful painting. We have a lot of focus on landscape here. And landscape is really a speciality of Caspar David Friedrich, because he is known to have turned landscape painting into a genre of its own. So he's really a pioneer of landscape painting, Caspar David Friedrich. And this landscape in particular is a little bit special because it combines the two tendencies that we see in Caspar David Friedrich's landscapes, which is, for one, the more realistical tendency. So this is a really realistic depiction, and also the more fantastical tendency. And by fantastical, I mean is that even though this painting, this landscape is so realistic, I doubt that a landscape like this exists anywhere in Germany. Perhaps it does so in, I don't know, Romania or in China. We do have landscapes like this, but in Germany, I think not so much. I think this landscape is fantasy, or as we might also say, it's made up. Okay, Caspar David Friedrich has made it up. And so this landscape kind of combines these two tendencies of Caspar David Friedrich, the realistic and the fantastical landscape. And you can see it in this tendency in many of his paintings, such as, for example, Kreidefelsen auf Rügen, which was also painted in 1818. And Rügen is a German island where Caspar David Friedrich spent a lot of time, his holidays, for example. And he makes this really realistic and elaborate paintings of this island called Rügen, almost like photos. And these are, of course, very realistic depictions of how this place actually looked like. The more fantastical landscape, an example, Das Eismeer, which means the sea of ice. It's a painting produced in 1823 to 1825, and Das Eismeer depicts ice shards growing out of the ground. And it's kind of strange. I don't think that anything like this here exists here in Germany. Perhaps somewhere in Russia or in Canada you have ice shards growing out of the ground. Here in Germany, I would say that this is more fantastical, so it's made up, by Caspar David Friedrich. And this painting, like I said, combines these two tendencies. We have a little bit of realism here, but also fantasy, like this rock here. Now, in terms of composition, the composition here is also very basic, academic. We have triangular composition right here. Here's a triangle. We also have here triangle, triangle here, triangle here. These are really compressed triangles for the mountain slopes here. They're kind of like arrows, almost look like wings, like the landscape is unfolding. It's very, very symmetrical. You could cut the painting in half and it would be almost symmetrical. So it's once again, very basic academic techniques that Caspar David Friedrich is employing to create a really beautiful painting. Now, in terms of color contrast, art students tend to love color contrast or color theory in my experience. And so you have probably picked up on the color contrast here. We have blue and yellow. Yellow here for the rock, and of course the blonde hair of this wanderer here. And so that would be the complementary contrast between blue and yellow. Once again, very academic and basic. And he doesn't just create a contrast between blue and yellow. We also see that all the light areas of the painting are in blue and all the darker areas of the painting are in yellow. So we don't just have a contrast between blue and yellow, but between light blue and dark yellow. So it's not just a color contrast in hue, but also in value and brightness, as we might say. So it's really beautiful, what Caspar David Friedrich does here. Now, I would like to move on to looking at the historical context that this painting was created in, because painting always exists within a certain context. And the context in this case would be the year 1818, which was in the midst of the first industrial revolution, which started at around the 1750s. And just as we are currently in the fourth industrial revolution concerning AI or artificial intelligence, the first industrial revolution was concerned with steam engines, which would slowly but steadily replace manual human labor. So you would have inventions such as, for example, the locomotive, and the locomotive is kind of a wagon that's powered by a steam engine. So you would have a steam engine that's turning the wheels, and that's how the locomotive moves forward. And that would be the precursor to our modern cars and trains. Or you would have the same for steamboats and steamships, sails being slowly replaced by steam-powered boats and ships. You would have factory-based manufacturing, of course. So, classic picture of 19th century London, for example, would be these brick factories and these giant chimneys rising from these buildings. And from these chimneys escapes all the steam and the dust produced by these steam engines contained within the factory. You would also have more miscellaneous inventions, such as, for example, the light bulb invented by Thomas Edison, replacing the candle. Back in the days, if you woke up at night, you had to walk around with a candle to see anything. Starting from the first industrial revolution, we would use electricity for that, to power light bulbs, to give us light. Or you also have the telegraph or the telephone being invented for communication, which would be the precursor to our modern smartphone. Now, I don't know where my smartphone is, but probably how your smartphone looks, the Apple, Samsung, Huawei, and so on. Now, what these inventions or these reforms in technology led to was that the population started moving here in Europe. The population here in Europe started moving from villages to cities. Reason being simply that the work started to be, resided in cities. So if you wanted to work, if you wanted to get employment, you had to move to a city to get that. It's kind of like today, I'm a graphic designer. And so I live here in the city of Mannheim because that's where the work is. They don't need graphic designers in villages. So if I would live in a village, I would be unemployed. That's why I have to live in a city to get employment, to get a job as a graphic designer. It was kind of like that back in the day during the first industrial revolution in the 19th century. However, the working conditions at that time were anything but pleasant, which is to say that they were quite frankly horrific. And I have actually collected a BBC article to state this point. And the BBC article lists a few of the facts about the working conditions during the Industrial Revolution. And the BBC article says that working hours were 12 to 14 per day. So you had to work 12 to 14 hours per day. Just imagine that. I mean, if you're an art student, it's probably no novelty to you, but people usually don't work 12 to 14 hours a day, okay, except us students. Women and children were preferred because they were paid less than half as men. And so factory owners, they wanted to save on money and budget, and that's why they employed women and children instead of men, because these women and children would get less than half of the salary for the same work being done, which is incredibly greedy, isn't it? You would have factory accidents involving especially children, you know, who were forced to crawl into these giant steam-powered machines to repair them, which probably isn't in the best interest of the child's health. You would have hearing damage being caused by loud machinery, and I really can't emphasize enough how loud a steam machine is. Here in Mannheim, we have in the museum a steam-powered book printing machine. I've actually seen it live once in action, and that machine is so bloody loud, it's quite honestly deafening. I could never imagine working 12 to 14 hours a day next to that thing. I'll probably turn completely deaf within a week or a month at maximum. You also have, of course, you know, we're working with steam engines, you know, steam. So you would get a lot of chest and lung diseases being caused by all this smoke and dust. Joining a trade union, Europe is quite famous for its trade unions, especially Germany, I think. But joining a trade union during the Industrial Revolution, not a good idea, because it would lead to you getting laid off. So you would just lose your employment status. And you would also become blacklisted. So after being unemployed, you would stay unemployed for quite a bit of time. You have children around the age of 6 years working in mines. So it's kind of like Minecraft, you know, but real life, and you have real children working there. And it probably sucks because it's tedious and exhausting, and you probably die. But that's the way it was back in the day. And you would have a lot of these children being trapped or killed by roof falls and explosions in these mines. And being killed is probably nicer than being trapped, because, you know, being trapped underground in complete darkness with tons of stone on your back, it's a slow and painful way to die. So it's not nice. However, all these horrible conditions that I just described to you, nothing of that is seen here in Caspar David Friedrich's painting. We see here no factories, no chimneys, no locomotives, no trains, no mines. We just see a natural landscape and one person wandering amidst it. Now, this painting is very minimal in its subject matter. We just have one person in the landscape. And so this painting was not created as a commentary on the societal problems during the Industrial Revolution, but it is instead more focused on our emotions and our feelings, on the inner world of the audience or the artist. And so looking at this painting, we get a lot of emotions of Freiheit, which means freedom or liberty, or Sehnsucht, which means yearning or longing. These are two words, okay, yearning or longing, or Fernweh. And Fernweh is really a special word in the German language because there's not really an English equivalent to it. It literally translates to far grief. So you probably know homesickness, which is the desire to stay at home. Fernweh is the opposite of that. Fernweh means that you want to get out, you want to be free, you want to walk off into the distance. And that's what we're seeing quite literally here. Now, problems in society will always cause some kind of reaction, and that reaction is most often political. The political reaction to the Industrial Revolution was, for example, the invention of communism by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the publication of the Communist Manifesto. But reactions to societal problems must not always be political, they can also be artistical. And so the artistic reaction to the first Industrial Revolution was what we now call Romanticism. So Romanticism is the artistic reaction to the first industrial revolution. And to explain what Romanticism is, I have collected a quote from Charles Baudelaire, who is a French poet. And he said, Le romantisme n'est précisément ni dans le choix des sujets, ni dans la vérité exacte, mais dans la manière de sentir. So he says Romanticism is precisely neither in the choice of subjects, which is what's being depicted in the painting, nor in the exact truth, which is objective reality in the classical sense, but in the manner of feeling. So what he's saying is that Romanticism is moving away from this objective outlook on life and more toward the subjective, on feelings and emotions and the inner life of a human person. And Caspar David Friedrich in this painting really condenses a lot of the tropes and characteristics of this Romanticism into one painting, which would be, for one, of course, the emotion, the focus on emotions and feelings, but also escapism from industrial society. Okay, we have this guy here escaping from what's probably behind his back, which would be industrial society, but he has Fernweh. He wants to get out. He wants to escape from the industrialization. That's why we see him here wandering off into the distance. We have also vast landscapes, of course, and Caspar David Friedrich being a pioneer of landscape painting. And of course, the Rückenfigur, as I said, you know, this guy here being a Rückenfigur, he has his back turned toward us. And the Rückenfigur is not an invention of Romanticism. However, Romanticism would shed a far more elementary spotlight onto the Rückenfigur as opposed to prior or even later artistic movements. And you see it quite often employed in Caspar David Friedrich's catalogue, such as, for example, in the Two Men Contemplating the Moon, and painting from the 1820s. Or another painting, Die Lebensstufen, and Lebensstufen means steps of life. It's a painting where Caspar David Friedrich depicts all the different generations still alive during his time, and we see these generations personified as Rückenfigurs. It's a painting from 1835, so shortly after this one. We also have portraits of Caspar David Friedrich's wives, the most famous one being this painting where she looks out into the window, and we look out with her because she has his back turned toward us. So Caspar David Friedrich made a lot of paintings where we see his wife as a Rückenfigur, as a back figure. Or from before the Romantic era, we have Jan Vermeer, a Baroque painter, and his painting The Art of Painting from the 1660s, where we see Jan Vermeer himself painting someone else. So it's a painting of Jan Vermeer painting. Quite strange, isn't it? But Jan Vermeer depicts himself as a Rückenfigur. So he has his back turned to us, so we get to see what he's painting on the panel. Or a contemporary of Caspar David Friedrich, Theodor Géricault, The Raft of Medusa from 1818. Same year as this one, 1818. Seems to be a great year in painting. And The Raft of Medusa shows many different Rückenfigures on this raft seeking out the horizon. Or more modern example, Star Wars. The original 1977 film where Luke Skywalker as a protagonist is standing on this desert planet, and he's standing on this rock, and he looks out to the sunset, and it's a really beautiful sunset of science fiction fantasy, you know, so we get two suns setting at the horizon, and the scene really gives similar feelings of yearning, longing, of freedom, of Fernweh. You know, Luke Skywalker wants to get out into the galaxy and have his own adventure. And so this is the artistic movement that Caspar David Friedrich became really a pioneer of, among other things, through this painting. And the Romantics would be really crucial, especially for our modern sensibilities in painting or art in general. And you have many now famous painters belonging to Romanticism, such as, for example, Ivan Aivatsovsky, who painted these really beautiful and expressive oceans. You have Thomas Cole, an American, I think, also very focused on landscape. Theodor Géricault, as I mentioned, from France. Also Eugène Delacroix. And Eugène Delacroix painted Madame France upholding the French Republican flag during the time of the French Revolution. And so Eugène Delacroix shows us the more political side of Romanticism as opposed to the emotional side that we're seeing here in The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. In England you have Joseph William Turner. In Spain you have Francesco de Goya, and Francesco de Goya is a special case because during the Spanish Civil War he experienced so many horrific things that he turned from a Baroque or Rococo painter into a Romantic painter because he experienced so much suffering. And later in his life he would create the now famous black paintings. You can look it up on Google, black paintings, Francesco de Goya, very impressive. And a later German artist, Max Ernst, who lived from 1891 to 1976, he would cite Caspar David Friedrich as a direct influence upon his work. So Max Ernst directly influenced by Caspar David Friedrich. Now what I wanted to take away from this lecture is that painting is emotion. And yes, as we will progress into the series, these lectures will become more and more focused on the objective side of painting and more on the intellectual and the technical stuff. However, if you really want to understand a painting, you need to make sure to foster some kind of emotional connection to it. And that's why I selected this painting for this first episode, because it's a painting I have an emotional connection to. I've known it since my youth, and I loved it since my youth. And you probably can find some kind of emotional connection to it too, you know, in these feelings of escapism and longing and freedom. And so that's your job, to make sure that you're not just approaching painting with a sound mind, but also with a passionate heart. And so that's it for today. I hope that you found this lecture helpful. If you want to stay up to tune on upcoming lectures, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. And thanks for joining me in the Académie Sans Saint. And until next time, je suis Frère François. Frères, adieu.